Hello students, welcome to this particular session on trying and understanding how a B school evaluates application in order to get into the B school, or in other words, how is it you look at B schools when you select them for your application. Now, first of all, let's start with an interesting case studies, because once you get into B schools, right, your life is entirely about case studies. You'll be completely going through a lot of case studies. So let's take the same approach. Now I have two interesting students or two profiles before me. We already looked at a previous case study when we were looking at this very important element called as profile. Yes, you need to build the right kind of profile, but also selecting the right kind of schools for the right kind of profile that you have built is very important. Now this case study is going to help us to understand that. Let's very quickly run through. Now for example, look at the first profile, right? This guy's got what? An 8-pointer CGPA, a 720 GMAT score if you look at the credentials, a 48-month work experience, good solid work experience. He worked with India's largest e-commerce company. He's as a senior software developer. He applied for MBA in MECOMs, Ross and Anderson's to a bunch of schools. Now look at profile 2. Look at his credentials, 7 CGPA, tier 2 college, and 700 GMAT score, pretty decent and on par with the first guy. Good solid 40 months of work experience, India's largest MNC in IT service company and consulting. As a team lead he's worked. He also applied to MBA, MECOMs, Ross and Anderson, the same set of schools. Now the same example guys. Now whenever I ask this question to like 100 audiences, I've taken lots of sessions, thousands of sessions across thousands of audiences. Let's say I ask this question to 100 students, right? 70 to 80% of the guys will pick up profile 1. Reason is very simple. Higher credentials in terms of GMAT, in terms of CGPA, and also in terms of work experience. But that's not the only way the B school looks at you guys, right? Let's quickly understand what are the results. Okay, now what is that we're going to understand is, see, first case study, when we looked at the first case study, right, if you have looked at the previous video, if you have not looked at that, please look at that and come and land on this particular video. Now, if you looked at that particular video, right, we have clearly expressed and told that why a profile is very, very important and how do you understand that. In this case study, we will try an understanding, although you have a good profile, why a B school selects only certain kinds of profile and does not give admit to other kind of profiles. So the point that you'll kind of infer here is, why is that every B school has its own set of DNAs. So we'll take some examples of schools. We'll try an understanding what the school expects and what is the average work experience, etc. And most importantly, you guys will understand one thing. What is that is, what are the challenges that you'll be facing while you shortlist your B schools for your application process. Let's quickly run through. Yes or no? Let's get started guys. Okay, now first of all, what I showed you, the usual way we present case studies. The first guy had a CGPA, he had work experience, etc, etc. Now, let's look at the second guy. Second guy had something little bit extra. What was that was, he had an international exposure across the APAC regions, the Asia Pacific I'm talking about. Now, what do I mean by international exposure is, he has worked in his company who had clients in those regions, where he has to work with clients, teams, etc along those regions, or he has to work in those market, like that sort, right? So for example, let's take EdTech, right? The way the students are in India are very, very different from the way the students are, let's say in China, or let's say in Indonesia, or the Europe or the US. It's a very, very diverse market. So similarly, this guy had an international across the APAC regions. And point number 2 is that, if I ask students, they naturally tend to select profile 1. Reason is very simple. Simple credentials like CGPA, work experience, GMAT score, somebody has it higher, therefore the B school is going to select them. No guys, it doesn't work that way, right? In fact, the profile 2 was successful, right? I'll tell you why. If you look at the schools that these both people applied, right? MECOMs, Anderson, Ross, these bunch of schools, these are kinds of schools who expect people to come in with a very, very strong, relevant work experience, at the same time have an appropriate career goal, at the same time have leadership experience. Now, what do we mean by leadership experiences? You might be a great guy in a company, a great contributor, a great developer, a great coder, anything for that matter. But just remember one thing, you should also translate your success with your team. So you can manage a small team where you developed a project. So as good as you are, your team is also as good as you are. If that's the case, then you have a natural skill of leadership or a teamwork. And these schools, MECOMs, Anderson, Ross, are the schools which expect that to be inside a profile or inside a candidate. So although profile 1 was excellent, you might be an excellent guy, right? He couldn't get the interview call simply because he lacked leadership experience. And these set of schools expect that as one of the criteria. Now look at profile 2. Relatively weaker compared to profile 1. Why did he get an interview call? Reason is very simple. A, this guy has a relevant work experience. B, he had a team lead experience, a leadership experience or a team management experience. At the same time, some brownie points he had was, he had an international exposure. So the point is, you might have anything guys. You might be great, you might be excellent, that's fine. But you need to understand the B school's DNA that you're applying. That is very, very critical. I'll tell you an example. Let's take Harvard. There are certain qualities Harvard is very, very concerned about. For example, habit of leadership, maintaining teams, projects, etc, and analytical aptitude and an appetite for the same, right? At the same time, do you have a little bit social impact? For example, engage community citizenship. Remember, we saw some bunch of peaks in the previous video. A profile needs to have this, that, etc., etc. So Harvard gives preference to certain peaks. For example, in this case, it's in leadership as well as a social impact. You take Stanford, a little bit different, right? It looks at your intellectual vitality, right? At the same time, it looks at your demonstrated leadership qualities. You take INSEAD. INSEAD looks at a very important contribution called as international exposure. You need to have it. In fact, every candidate getting inside INSEAD has not just an international exposure, has a very, very strong international exposure. Again, leadership potential. And it looks at one important factor, your ability to contribute back to INSEAD. Doesn't mean that you need to work in INSEAD for 5 months, 6 months. That's not what it means. For example, how is it going to help your alums? How is it going to help your juniors? Right? How is it going to help your class profile? Right? That is very important aspects. Okay. Or let's take the other way around. Let's take ESMT Berlin in Germany, right? It wants you to have a prior knowledge of German. They look at quantitative at the same time qualitative ability, right? They look for an international output. Take IMD Swiss. IMD Swiss is very, very difficult to get into, not because it's very challenging, right? 80% of the applicants have an average work experience of 7+. Okay, I'm sorry, not even average. The cutoff work experience is 7+, because the class age that is entering is between 28 to 32. So by the time you're 28, you should naturally have 6 to 7 or at least even 8 years of work experience. And it's an extremely small class size. Take IMA. When I'm talking about IMA for your bandwidth of work experience, I'm talking about the 1-year program, right? When you look at the 1-year program, right, it is mandatory to have international exposure. They're very, very critical about that. So that's the point, guys. This is one way to look at it. The other way to select B schools is that, you can select it in terms of countries and continents, right? There are certain schools which have certain, let's say, average work experience, right? You can look at that factor. Second thing is, you can look at the duration of the course. For example, take US. US, majority of the program are 2-year programs. Similarly, when you take Europe, right, majority of the program are 1-year programs. There's a difference why there is a 2-year, 1-year, etc. That's a different debate altogether. So you can also shortlist based on that parameter. And most importantly, this consent or a two-way communication is important, guys. You need to understand this. I'll tell you what. So you have glorious dreams and expectations on the B school, which is absolutely fair. Because come on, you're investing not just $1, $2, but let's say thousands and thousands of dollars, right? So you have a lot of expectation in the school, absolutely fair enough, which can be certified, which can be adjusted, and the schools of that sort can be shortlisted, no doubt about that. But let's remember one thing. There's something the school expects from you. You need to match that. Simple parameter. For example, take above the line, right? Parameters above the line. Something like, let's say, region, cost, duration of the course, etc. is something you expect from the school. But at the same time, there are parameters like your CGPA, your GMAT score, your undergrad, your work experience, your essays, LORs, extracurriculars, or in other words, simply called as a profile, is something the school will expect from you. So if you have these kind of profiles, I'll take you. If you don't have, however good you are, however great GMAT score you are, whoever you are, we don't want you. The school is very, very particular about that. You keep that in mind, guys. That's very important. So, why these parameters matter more? I'll tell you. For example, first thing they look into is diversity, right? Very similar profiles. One guy would have had an exceptional GMAT score, right? The other guy would have had a very low GMAT score, but a very diverse experience. Let's say he's coming from a biology background, or let's say he's coming from a merchant navy, or let's say he's coming from a chartered accountant, even that is a lot crowded otherwise, right? Or let's say this guy is coming from an entrepreneurship or in small business, then that's what the eccentric profiles B school look into. Okay, if you're not able to provide that, absolutely fine. Do you have an appropriate career goal? Can you justify that? They will look into that. And most importantly, the culture of the school, whether you match that or not. Right? That is very, very important. And most importantly, right? Most importantly, for the B school, this is very, very critical. What is that is? What is that you're going to do post your MP? Where is that you're going to position your work? Where is that you're going to position your career? That is very, very important. If you don't justify that, that's it, guys. Your journey ends there. You cannot apply to the B school, right? So what we call is your fit matters. And one more thing. There is something called as a specialization ranking for a B school. Okay, specialization ranking is there. On top of that, there are certain factors inside the B school. If you carefully evaluate, you can optimize A, your fees that you spend in, B, the ease of you getting inside the B school, C, the range of GMAT metrics, the qualitative metrics, and D, the placement opportunities in the starting salaries. And do you know that you can actually optimize your B school based on these parameters? I'll give a simple example. For example, the one that's right there on your screen, right? Let's say you're a guy from finance. You go Google information, you will find NY Eastern, one of the very, very great schools for finance. Reason is very simple. NY Eastern is a very old university, and it's located in New York, the hub of, let's say, the financial hub of US, right? Where all your stock markets, etc., etc. there. But the problem, look at the fees, $75,000 US per annum, and it's a 2-year program, by the way, right? And point number 2, the acceptance percentage is very, very less. GMAT score is exceptionally high. Placements excellent, because when the school is more difficult to get inside, obviously the salaries are going to be great. But what if I can tell you some interesting options? I'll start with one. Baruch College, Zicklin School of Business. Fees $30,000 US per annum. Half of NY's turn. But does that mean that school is a double school or anywhere lesser than NY's turn? No. Look at the acceptance percentage, 40%. More easier to get into, which means it's a very, very bad school? No. Look at the GMAT score, 640 to 650. Does it mean it's absolutely useless school because the average GMAT score of the class is just 640? That's where it's a no, guys. Why no for all these things is, look at the placement percentage. How much is written? 87%. Look at NY's turn, 89%. On par. Ultimately, that matters. Okay, let's look at the starting salaries. $105K US dollars per annum. Look at this, $125K dollars per annum. Is it a very big difference? And by the way, please remember, your fees is lesser in Zicklin School of Business and your starting salaries are much, much higher. And equal placement opportunities or in fact, much easier option to get into. Like I can give the same example. Look at the same metrics. You have already gone through the metrics, right? For example, look at University of Rochester or look at Illinois, right? This is for finance. Now let's say people who love marketing. The natural choice that comes to my mind is Kellogg. Kellogg is the school for marketing, no doubt about that. Fees, $65,000 US dollars, massive. Acceptance rate is very less. Very high GMAT score, 730 is a tough GMAT score, guys. Placement is excellent, starting salaries is like on top of the roof. But, look at this school called as Fordham University. Much lesser fees, much easier to get into, 50%. Two guys apply, one guy goes inside, right? Very average GMAT score, 600. 78% placement, $60,000 US dollars salaries. Look at Carlson School of Management, $106K US dollars. Look at Michigan State, much cheaper, much easier to get into, much average GMAT score, on par placement percentage and on par or little bit lesser salaries. Similarly, I can give any number of examples. For example, let's take supply chain, Wharton, the school that naturally comes to your mind. Fees is massive, very difficult to get inside, placement is top-notch quality, salaries are much, much higher. Let me give you some alternate options. For example, take University of Alabama, or let's take Purdue University. Take the Penn State, not the Pennsylvania. I mean, university, if you take Wharton, right, it comes under University of Pennsylvania. Whereas as a Penn State college, right? So this is very, very important, guys. When you select schools, right, don't just go by the brands. I'm not saying brand does not add values. There are more easier, cheaper, effective options that you can get inside, right? For example, take IT or MIS, Masters in Information Science, right? MIT is the school for it. But there's a very interesting option called as University of Texas, Dallas. Same philosophy, lesser fees, better acceptance percentage, lower GMAT criteria, higher success percentage or placement percentage, and a on par starting salaries. That is very, very important. Okay, so let's understand one thing, guys. There are a bunch of difficulties that you're going to face when you guys select your schools. Very, very simple. Let's take the process before that. A, you need to do enormous amount of research. And by the way, what I've shown you is just the tip of iceberg. It's just the tip of iceberg, guys. I've taken 4 big specializations, taken a bunch of schools. What if we can tell you there are 100 more different options? So naturally, the time that you spent on doing your research is massive. A. Point number 2, most of the information that you get on internet, it's crowdsourced. It is crowdsourced. Big question, whether it's right or wrong. And most importantly, what do you want to do from your MBA? Have you justified that? Have you consulted with someone to understand what you want to do, right? And who is going to help you through this process? And that's why there's a very, very professional approach that you can take. Anyway, these details, end of the session, I'll definitely tell you. So that is very, very critical. What is that? It's always important to understand the B school requirements. Otherwise, you might end up completely applying to a wrong set of schools. Please understand that. And most importantly, the acceptance percentage for a school and the acceptance percentage for a program are very, very different. So both your qualitative and your quantitative parameters matters, and you most importantly had this lesson. What is this lesson is, hey, what are the challenges that I'm going to face when I'm going to select my B school? And most importantly, is MIM or MBA the only program that you can apply for? What if we can tell you some very, very interesting option or what we call as an alternatives for MBA? Want to know more? Follow the instructions.